Welcome everybody. So I'm gonna do formally anyway, so that I can suitably embarrass you with all the great things that you've done. Um, so he'll be presenting his PhD dissertation research this morning. It has a very long title, so I'll let you say it. Um, but it deals with a number of his research interests, including adaptation to sea level rise and site suitability, land use change, and ecosystem service valuation. So I first met Famara when he was a master's student at Humphrey, and he was taking a class that I co-taught on science and policy of global change. And I don't know if you remember, Famara, we talked several times during the course, and you expressed interest in doing. You told me about this really tough problem facing your home country, the Gambia, in particular, sea level rise and how it threatened the capital city of Banjul. And we talked at length about various things, and you laid out a very compelling vision of how you would like to address these issues in your PhD research. So we fast forward several years, and we'll let you tell us about that. But Famara has an impressive set of awards and accomplishments already. It's pretty unusual for when I'm introducing a graduate student that there's this lengthy of a list, but let me run through them. So he has a master's degree in international development practice with a minor in science, technology, environmental policy from Humphrey. This coming year, he's going to be a fellow on a project on forced displacement, which is sponsored by the UK Department for International Development and the World Bank and the UN Refugee Agency. And this is at the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center in Copenhagen. He has received a long list of awards, including the Joseph Mestenhauser Student Award for Excellence in Campus Internationalization. He was a graduate scholar for the CREATE initiative that Bonnie founded. He's been given other graduate fellowships, Robert and Paula Berry Graduate Fellow for International Trade, Development, and Public Policy, Gerald Mullen Distinguished Graduate Fellow for International Peace, William R. and Barbara A. Pierce Family Fellow, and Mandela Washington Fellow as part of the President Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative. That is quite a list. Outside of academia, he is the founding executive director of the Household Disaster Resilience Project of Gambia, which is an NGO in the Gambia. He is country leader for the Gambia for the World Cleanup Movement, and he was director of administration for the National Disaster Management Agency and assistant secretary at the Ministry of Fisheries and Water Resources in the Gambia. As is probably quite clear from this, he has boundless energy and infectious enthusiasm, and it has been a real joy to work with him during his PhD. So now that I've suitably embarrassed you, Famara, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pulaski, for that introduction. I think I was over generous. So we're gonna, allow me to share my slides. Well, first of all, let me say thank you all for joining us this morning. It's quite early in the morning. It's not the usual time for myself included. So I'll start by saying that as a Muslim, I would like to thank God. I will say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. I thank God for making today a possibility. It is indeed a blessing to be alive today and to be healthy, given the risk of the COVID-19 pandemic. I also like to say that because we'll be discussing an intergenerational question, I am really, really lucky to defend my dissertation on my son's golden birthday. So to Majar, I say happy birthday. And I hope that he does care about climate change issues in the future. So before I start the presentation, Madam Chair, I would like to take a few minutes to So my appreciation and acknowledgement for the support I have received. Because I believe that a PhD is not a single individual's effort, it's a conglomeration of efforts and sacrifices from various people. So to my advisory committee members, to Dr. Polaski, Dr. Keller, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Current, I'm profoundly grateful for the motivation, the guidance, the technical and moral support I have received over the years. I'm really, really thankful. I also like to express or show acknowledgement for the funding I have received to do my research and complete my studies. Really not knowing the decision of the committee today, I would like to tell my advisor, Professor Steve Polaski, that you've already changed my life and the life of my family by providing this funding. And please also allow me to acknowledge additional funding and show appreciation for the assistantships and fellowship I have received through the support of the Madam Chairperson today, Dr. Kera. I am grateful, and these fundings were provided at times when it was most needed. So on behalf of my family here in the United States and in the Gambia, I say thank you for your generosity. I would quickly like to send some thank you notes to other reviewers for their valuable comments. I'd like to thank government institutions in the Gambia who supported me during my field work, the National Disaster Management Agency, National Environment Agency, Ministry of Fisheries and Water Resources, Gambian Printing, and AFISA. And to my research assistants, 40 undergraduate students from the University of the Gambia, I also like to thank them for their valuable support. Many thanks to my immediate family and extended family here in Minnesota and in the Gambia, and special thanks to my mom, my dad, my wife, and kids for their love and sacrifice. So my advisor was overgenerous in his introduction. I would like to say one thing about my professional background, which was when I was the Director of Admin and Human Resources at the National Disaster Management Agency. So I say that the incredible work of this agency actually inspired me to study issues around disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, to reduce vulnerability and build resilient and resourceful communities in the Gambia and around the world. So we'll skip my educational background. I'll start by actually introducing the dissertation title. So with your permission, Madam Chair, I hope this is when my 40 minutes begin. So my title is Ecosystem Services and Coastal Adaptation to Climate Change. It's considered to be an interdisciplinary science-based application in the Gambia. And the outline of our discussion today will be as follows. So we'll have an overview. Actually, the overview will take about 10 minutes or so. And for each of the chapters, we'll go really quickly, maybe about 5 to 7 minutes on each of the chapters. So let's position the Gambia on the African map. Looking at the Gambia, it's a small West African country surrounded by the Republic of Senegal on all three sides. And on the western side, you have the Atlantic Ocean. The Gambia has a population of 2.1 million people, and nearly 60% of our population are resided or are located nearly about 25 kilometers from the coastline. So we are heavily concentrated on the west side of the country. The Gambia was listed among the 100 critical countries most vulnerable to climate change by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It's important that we introduce the overall research problem here. We're dealing with a country that is low-lying, a country that's not highly exposed, but also heavily vulnerable, a country with less resilient and adaptive capacity. And one of the climate hazards we'll be looking at today is rising sea level and extreme precipitation events. And with the RCP projections 6 and 8.5, we know that with the mid rise in global mean sea level, which is likely to be the case before the end of this century, my capital city, the capital city of the Gambia, will be underwater, and some parts of the country will also be destroyed, including damage to properties and public infrastructure. So this is a complicated research statement, so to speak, and one student cannot really discuss all of the issues at stake. So I try to have a little bit of focus here, and I focus on coastal adaptation questions. And here we're looking at adaptation in the form of protection, building resilient communities to reduce vulnerability. Also thinking about adaptation in the form of migration at the household level, and adaptation in the form of managed retreat, which is like relocation of a whole capital city by a government. The other component of my work focuses on ecosystem service. Of course, as a student of Steve, you can't be more excited about anything other than ecosystem services, because we know this whole idea of the economic invisibility of nature, and nature has enormous benefits that we as people and governments enjoy. And in most cases, these services or benefits are unaccounted for or are even omitted in our systems of accounts. So we're looking at coastal ecosystems and also a little bit on forest ecosystems here. So the state of the literature, before I get into this work, of course, things has changed before I complete the project. We have actually seen a lot of coastal vulnerability assessment studies. And these studies, including studies conducted in the Gambia, really looked at our coastline and assessed the vulnerabilities. So in terms of vulnerability, we know that we are looking at a very vulnerable coastline, highly exposed to rising sea level and other climate hazards. For coastal ecosystem services, there has been several studies, but most of these studies have been conducted in the developed world, in Europe and in America. For site suitability analysis using multi-criteria decision-making procedure, which is one of the methodologies I use in my study, this methodology has been applied in a range of different disciplines, different fields by different authors for different projects. So the research gaps I was able to identify before would be the fact that we know very little about people's willingness to migrate from coastal communities at high risk to climate and extreme weather events. And I think this is across the board. If you talk to people in Florida, some people will say, we are leaving, some will say, we're not going anywhere, we're staying here, we'll build our resilience and stay to adapt to climate change. So what do we know about this issue? The other thing is that we know less about people's willingness to pay for mitigation projects, especially in developing countries, more so in Africa. And site identification using this specific methodology, which is multi-criteria decision-making analysis for city relocation, I underline that, is neither, either not studied or understudied. I couldn't find or trace evidence on the application of this methodology for studying, for putting it into this context. The contributions therefore are as follow. We'll start with the contributions. I think that my study enhances our understanding of migration as an adaptation strategy to mitigate environmental and climate risk factors. Now, evidence shows that the out-migration, which we'll talk about a little bit, from the Gambia's capital city, Banjul, is predominantly driven by environmental and climate-related factors, not economic, as mainly claimed to be the root causes of migration, starting from the laws of migration by Ravenstein in the 1800s to the micro-model of the neoclassical economic theory. The second is that this study enhances our understanding of willingness to pay for climate change mitigation projects among people in a least developed country context here in the Gambia. The argument that poor people have limited or less, or in some cases, zero willingness to pay for restoration and mitigation projects due to liquidity constraint may not necessarily be true. In our study, Gambians express high willingness to pay for coastal protection despite being poor. And we've seen conclusion from Abramson and other studies that support this finding. Now, the point here is that you need to look at other ways to account for people's value on restoration and mitigation projects, not just the income premise. So therefore, we contribute to quantifying the economic value of coastal ecosystem services provided by nature to a developing country economy. And three, the study contributes to land use, land cover assessment, and ecosystem service valuation. In this case, carbon sequestration in the Gambia. I think I am the first one to do a change detection on land use, land cover. I couldn't find any other study that did that, especially using remotely sensed data. Three, it advances the applicability of remote sensing and GIS-based multi-criteria decision-making procedure for site identification, i.e. for a whole capital city. And beyond academia, of course, it will help policymakers to understand the economics of natural resources and climate change adaptation in their decision-making procedures. So the overall research methodology here would be considered a mixed approach. We use both qualitative and quantitative ways of analyzing our data. And the data sources really came from two major areas. Primary data sources, over 1,000 Gambians were consulted on the various chapters of this dissertation, from one-on-one interviews to online surveys. So we did household surveys, community surveys, individual contingent valuation surveys. For the secondary data, we relied on census data, government reports, journal articles, and satellite imagery. I would like to say the exciting part of the project was when I visited the Gambia in the summer of 2018 for my primary data collection. I was lucky to work with about 40 undergraduate students from the University of the Gambia. And before my visit, I made some YouTube videos to explain the concept and the research that we're looking at, most of which was like contingent evaluation. Is a study that none of these students know about. So we had to, provide as much information as we could. There was training component. When I went, we had about over a week-long training, and there was also demonstration. So one of the students will serve as an interview, the other will be as a respondent. And we invited experts from the Gambia Bureau of Statistics to also come and help the students in terms of preparing them for the field. Before we get to the field, I also had an interface with government officials. This is the Coastal and Marine Working Group under the National Environment Agency. So it's a multi-sectoral group coming from different sectors of the economy. So their input was also valuable in improving the final survey. We had pre-tested the survey and clarified some of the questions for the main survey. And there was community sensitization also involved. So we were on the radio stations and on the television station, basically trying to tell the community what they could expect when they see the students in the communities on the beach side. So there was national news coverage of our survey. That was also exciting. And the main survey, really, one part of it was on the beach side and the other aspects were in the communities or at the household level. There was field editing involved. Every team has a supervisor and a field editor, and the role of the editor is to make sure that the interviewers' questionnaires are correctly recorded, and that was also helpful for the data entry. For the most part, most of the students who helped me were the people who also assisted with data entry at my former office. These activities were done at night, the data entry aspect. So I would like to say that this group was one of the most exciting journeys I could recall. And we had farewell picnic and went back to the beach to enjoy the same ecosystem services that has to be provided by nature on this side. So we'll get started with the chapters. That's the overview of the entire dissertation, but we'll go very quickly on each of the chapters. So the research gap we're looking at for chapter 1 is this fact that, or the idea that we don't really seem to know a lot about people's willingness to migrate from coastal communities at high risk to climate and environmental, including extreme weather events. Did you know that nearly over 1,000 people, this is equivalent to 375 households, migrated from the Gambia's capital city, Banjul, since 1983, a capital that is known to the Gambia as Washington, D.C. to the United States. In other words, is our political and administrative capital city. Lots of government institutions are located in this side. Banjul is not also just an administrative city, but it's also a commercial city. Lots of business trade transactions are taking place in this city. So in sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at Banjul in contrast to other cities in sub-Saharan Africa, it seems like Banjul is an outlier in terms of population trend. You see population from other sub-Saharan Africas that are growing over time, and in Banjul we are seeing this reduction. Could this be environmentally induced migration? In fact, recently, nearly 2 weeks ago, a man died in Banjul, and Banjulians link his death to poor drainage in the city as the torrential rainfall events begin in the country. This is what you will likely, continue to see until the end of the rainy season. Well, what do we know about climate-induced migration? Well, the first IPCC report says the gravest effects of climate change may be those on human migration, as millions will be displaced. The report predicted that 150 million people will be displaced by climate change by 2050. Recently, the World Bank reports that by 2050, if no action is taken, there will be more than 143 million internal climate migrants across these 2 regions of the world. This is just 3 regions, right? And 60% of these migrants would be coming from sub-Saharan Africa, of course, in the Gambia included. Who are climate migrants? We can briefly define them as people who lost or will lose their homes and possessions. They are or will be isolated from cultural and family ties. When they are trapped by extreme weather events, they are trapped without resources to move, and they are mostly internally displaced. When they cross borders, they are considered refugees, climate refugees, environmental refugees, refugees without any legal status by any United Nations organization. In fact, today we're told that today there are 2 times more climate migrants than the United Nations recognized refugees. Then the fundamental question that we asked to look into this issue of migration or out-migration from Banjul are 2. 1, what factors are inducing or influencing households' decision to migrate from Banjul? And how will islanders respond in terms of a scenario we gave them, which is a willingness to migrate scenario, with or without government's intervention to facilitate their migration? We look at the migration literature again and look at the types, the factors and theories of migration. I summarize it in this way in terms of types of migration. Just like to emphasize that the migration pattern we observe in Banjul is really voluntary migration. It's not necessarily a forced migration. It's mainly internal. 95% of this migration is internal, and 98% is urban to urban migration. And all of this, majority, if not all of this migration is considered to be permanent. They're leaving for good. They're not coming back to Banjul. So we look at the causes, or others we call the drivers or the induced factors of migration, why, and we use a framework used by several migration scholars, including Black and others, just categorizing migration drivers into environmental/climate, economic, socio-cultural, political, and other factors. You could also think of these drivers as push factors, just like Hunter calls them hazards or disamenities, or pull factors, which could be considered as amenities. So all of these can explain how people, why, and how people migrate in relation to each of these factors. The theories of migration is an interesting part. We learned that from the laws of migration to the neoclassical economics theory of migration, the leading argument for why people migrate has always been an economic one. The people are migrating because of economic reasons, jobs, and that. That's not the migration that explains, that's not the theory that explains the migration pattern we saw in Banjul. The theory that explains is the new economics theory of migration, which sees migration as a risk reduction strategy employed by a household instead of isolated individual actors. So it's important that we understand that households sometimes do not have to leave for economic reasons. They can leave to mitigate a risk, a climate risk in this case, which could be a climate hazard, could be sea level rise. So Robert McClellan helped us to solve for migration as an adaptation strategy in the climate change context. So where he says migration in the context of vulnerability is a function of exposure to a climate hazard, in this case, rising sea level, sensitivity of the exposed population, and adaptation options other than migration. We could also assess climate risk factors based on hazard, vulnerability, and exposure interaction. That's also similar to how Robert kind of solved for the migration in this context. So the results of this chapter really are on the issue of willingness to migrate. We found that nearly 55% of our respondents responded that they will migrate from the capital city in the next 50 years, in the next couple of decades. By 2050, that was the timeline. And this is without government's intervention. So with government support, government's intervention to facilitate their migration, 64% will respond. The reason cited for their out-migration, here we cannot qualitatively arrange it this here, but it's going to be mostly on environmental/climate related hazards. That's the reason from the qualitative data that we collect. For those who wanted to stay and having no migration intent, we could relate that to what Fisher calls the immobility paradox, right? Even that there are known environmental threats, some people will remain in their homestay, right? Because of emotional attachment to place. People love where they come from. And if they are not forced or they don't see the need, they may not leave. So we also applied econometrics data analysis on this using regression analysis. And here we use probit regression and compare our results to logistic regression. The category of variables included are socioeconomic, demographic characteristics, perception of out-migration. This idea that why did people leave? Because we asked the current residents to give us an idea why they thought their neighbors left. So the result here, this is just the factor variable. The dependent variable here is a dichotomous one. So is this idea willingness to migrate, yes or no? And we're only looking at the factor variables, not the entire variables included in the model. We could interpret this to say that a household is nearly 25% more likely to migrate if it perceives that their out-migration from Banjul is really related to environmental and climate risk factors. And also a household is 26% more likely to migrate or consider migration if it agrees that we, the Gambia, need to build a new capital city. So I'll quickly go and look at the conceptual model that's frequently being used by migration researchers to connect climate change to migration. The common sense model would be, well, there is climate change, that house will be inundated because of sea level rise and the family will have to be relocated or evacuated. Now we can make this a little more complicated. I'm not gonna go into the details of it, but we know that climate change here could be a driver and the stressor could be global warming. With climate change, we know there is warming and there are ecological effects, thermal expansion of ozone, loss of ice masses, and the melting of glaciers, changes in the terrestrial water storage. And that leads to sea level rise. When there is sea level rise, we know there are two things that happen. Immediately there are direct, what they call direct impacts, like things like damage to public and private properties, saltwater intrusion. And that leads to indirect impacts. And overall, it affects the overall functionality of the household. And they think about adaptation options. How do we respond? Migration becomes an option, but it's important to emphasize that before communities venture into migration, they think about other adaptation options like accommodation, modification, or protection of their vulnerability level. If the cost of protection is really high, people will consider to migrate. And that is the model that Patch Nelson and others gave us in 2008. But what they did not tell us is this idea of anticipated risk, right? Some communities do not have to be completely inundated or destroyed before they consider migration. And that is anchored on the new economic theory of migration, that some people will just perceive the risk and they will migrate. They don't necessarily have to wait for all of that damage. And Patch Nelson and others model also did not tell us anything about the vulnerability group. So we try to include that in remodeling this conceptual model here. And here's the original Patch Nelson and others model. So the conclusion here we could drive is that we recommend that the Gambia government recently published their new forced climate change policy, and the word migration relocation as an option has not been discussed. So it seems like the government or policymakers are not seeing this aspect of adaptation. So it's important that they consider that. In terms of investment, there's this question when I started the research: should we protect or should we not protect Banjul? It still remains an open question. Whether using hard or soft engineering solution, the question of protection has to be based on a cost-benefit analysis study. And we can conclude by saying that anchored on the new economic theory of migration, households in Banjul use migration as an adaptation strategy. And also important to emphasize that migration does not necessarily imply what McCarthy and others call a reactive adaptation to a negative shock. Sometimes it can be a positive anticipatory response. So chapter 2, we are now looking at site suitability using multi-criteria decision-making analysis for city relocation. So this is one of the options in terms of coastal adaptation to climate change, that you have to think about relocating a whole capital. And the first question with relocation is where to go, because you want to avoid the same problem that you were facing. In terms of the methodology for this study, like I said before, we couldn't raise evidence on it. The questions then become: does the Gambia need a second capital city or a new capital city? If so, where? So like unlike chapter 1, chapter 2 is more of managed retreat at the level of the government. And relocation, it's important to say, relocation may reduce vulnerability, and relocation for some communities, for instance, like these communities, 3 American Indian communities located in the west coast of Alaska, they chose relocation as the only feasible solution to permanently protect them from climate change impact. So it's important that we don't neglect the fact that relocation is still an option. Our simplified methodology to answer this question would be this. Well, let's conduct a public opinion survey of Gambians, and we did that. So our respondents for this chapter were actually based in almost every region of the continent, you could see almost, right? Gambians in the Gambia and Gambians in the diaspora. So in terms of their response to the first question, does the Gambia need a capital, a new capital city? From nearly 500 of our respondents, 81% strongly agree that yes, the Gambia needs a second capital city, and 11% somewhat agree. Where should the city be located? 52% of the public felt that the city should be located in the West Coast region. So let's keep that region in mind for a bit, because we'll talk more about it a little bit, the West Coast region. So on their opinion of land use or land cover to be converted, Gambians are okay with any other land cover type, but forest and agricultural land. They emphasize, you could see from this that they're okay with bare soil to be transformed for a new capital city, but not forest and agricultural land, really based on their first or second choice. So using a more robust methodology here, we use remotely sensed data and apply it in the GIS-based multi-criteria decision-making procedure. The specific technique we use is called analytical hierarchy process. And this methodology has been applied in, like I said, in various areas from urban development, including industrial site location, agricultural site suitability analysis, comparative business locations, locations for utility scale solar panels, emergency evacuation shelter locations across different countries and across different continents and by different artists. So this schematic model really summarizes the suitability analysis component of this work. To do a suitability analysis, you have to start with a literature review. And second, you need to know the sources of data you need. You have all of the required data to conduct this analysis. It's important that you also lay out a suitability goal and suitability objective. Now, having predetermined objectives is really important to avoid bias when it comes to the decision-making process, but also to enhance transparency in the process. So we did that, and we also look at the criteria that we need and sub-criteria which you could consider as indicators here. So for each of the indicators in the decision-making stage, you have to give them scores and weights, and those scores and weights used in this study are actually informed by a public opinion survey that we did, and eventually use GIS to do reclassification and having your final suitability map. So let's just give us some of the maps here to have an idea of what I was talking about. So the initial site selection to identify, here we call them proposed candidate sites. We included 4 administrative regions. The Gambia has 7 administrative regions. 3 have been excluded for reasons that are really important. The Upper River region has been excluded because it's really far from the majority of the pop. That's one of the criteria of the study. And the Kanifi Municipal Council is densely overly populated with nearly 5,000 people in a square kilometer. So it's also been excluded because there's no space. And of course, Banjul has been excluded because, you know, it's the problem we're trying to run away from. We also look at elevation because of this elevation problem, and say elevation less than or equals to 3 meters in any part of the country will be excluded. So it's considered non-exploitable region as far as the analysis is concerned. So for the GIS-based component, this is the flow chart on how we made each of the maps. But it's important just to highlight the data sources for the map. The data came from World Bank, the US Geological Survey, NASA, FAO, Gambia Bureau of Statistics, and the Department of Water Resources. And here are examples of the sample maps that went into the analysis. This is the land use land cover classification map for the Gambia and for the proposed candidate sites. So the rectangles there you see are the proposed candidate sites from the 4 regions I highlighted above. We also had a digital elevation model for all of these sites and including the entire country. And we had a topographic index, which is called the Compound Topographic Index. It's a hydrologic model. It really helps us to understand flow direction and flow accumulation of water on the landscape. We look at climate indicators. In here, we look at extreme maximum temperature and rainfall by region. We also look at demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, population density, poverty rate, unemployment rate by region, and also look at migration flow from birth to current resident of the people. We look at critical infrastructures in the country. It's important that building a new city, you think about, do you have current, how can you leverage the use of current infrastructure? So we buffer the candidate sites with a buffer distance of 1 to 5 kilometers to see what sort of infrastructures are around each of the proposed candidate sites, and also look at infrastructures across the entire country. The map on the left-hand side here is an accessibility map that shows the darker blue shows areas that are more accessible to people within a short period of time. Like I said, there was rasterization of the vector maps, and there was reclassification of all of the maps. And here's a sample reclassified map. So the classification, the suitability classes that we reclassified them to are 4, not suitable at all, poorly suitable, moderately suitable, highly suitable. And we applied the weighted overlay analysis in ArcGIS Pro. And here's our final suitability map. Unlike the public opinion, the suitability map says that the Lower River region seems to be the most suitable for locating the capital city of the Gambia. However, the public said it was the West Coast region. So the conclusion we could draw here is that choosing the West Coast region may pose ecological damage to the remaining forest cover. And remember that the public said that they don't want the forest to be destroyed or to be depleted. So it's important, however, to state that West Coast has been, it's public preference. Choosing the Lower River region for, at least based on the methodology we applied here, would be most suitable. But there might be a little more transaction cost compared to the West Coast region because Lower River region is little distant from the majority of the population. So that's the conclusion we can draw. Now, chapter 3 looks at this issue of what do we know about land use, land cover change? Since the public is now talking about don't use forest, don't use agricultural land, but use other land types. So we combine this with some ecosystem service valuation issues, looking at carbon sequestration, carbon storage and value in the Gambia in the past, and also future projections there. The motivation for doing chapter 3 is really from chapter 2. That is this idea that nearly 68% of our forests in good ecological condition are in the West Coast region. The public also told us that they don't want the West Coast region, they don't want the forest to be destroyed for building a new city. So if they are pointing to a direction or a location or a region, and we're seeing that there is a lot of forest in that, it is really important to look into that really closely. So here we call the study site the southwestern region of the Gambia. It combines the West Coast region, the Kanifi Municipal Council, and the Banjul City Council. And the questions then become, to what extent has land use land cover changed between 1985 to 2020 in the study area, and how much forest cover will remain on the different development scenarios, and how much carbon has been gained or lost in the study area in the period, what will happen in the future, and what is the economic value of that. Just like the previous chapters, we did literature review. We understood that deforestation rate in the Gambia has been growing rapidly. In fact, the Gambia has lost nearly 50% of the national forest cover in less than 80 years, 80 years. Deforestation rate is about 6% per annum. So we look at the drivers of deforestation and challenges to preventing or coping deforestation. But let's just look at the results here in terms of what we have detected in terms of land use change. So the study area lost 22,408 hectares of forest cover between 1985 to 2020. And the remaining forest we looked at based on the trend of urbanization, the trend of real estate development in the region. The remaining forest is highly exposed to destruction due to those two main reasons, urbanization and wood extraction. So we looked at the scenario here. We look at what will happen to the region in the next couple of decades, in three decades to come. We have business as usual, a new capital city scenario, that is the NCC, and we have a sustainability scenario, set of policy actions that government could take. With the business as usual, I can talk more about this if we have time, but with the business as usual, we predict that by 2050, only 11% of the total land area will remain forest. With the new capital city scenario, it will even be less than that. So about 5% of the total land area will be forest. What you will see with the new capital city compared to business as usual is the idea that government will destroy forest areas in the name of infrastructural development. We've seen recently this new government that came, they decimated 16 hectares of forest land, actually a monkey park that is really attractive for tourism and for other benefits, other ecosystem service benefits. It has been destroyed to locate a conference center, and that's the conference center you could see on this map. So the sustainability scenario, like I said, is just sets of policy agendas or actions that we propose if government could do will mitigate deforestation and land degradation in this area. And the goal here is to maintain 25% of the total land area as forest in the study area by 2050. The sustainability targets are on four broad areas. One is payment for ecosystem services. It's important to acknowledge that our people rely on natural resources to sustain their life and livelihood. So it is not going to be justifiable to ask people to prevent using these natural resources at their own expense. So perhaps providing some economic incentive programs like RED Plus or conservation easement programs could be provided for people to get some monetary benefit for preservation or conservation efforts. Protected areas is another strategy to keep forests in good health. So we propose specific areas along across the region for government to consider as protected areas. And this is equivalent to about 6% of the total land area. Remember in chapter 2, Gambians said that they don't want agricultural land to go. So it's important for food security, for food sovereignty. We don't want to be net importers of the things that we grow. So this idea of growing what we eat and eat what we grow is a common saying in the Gambia. So perhaps it's important to have about 10% of the total land area for urban agriculture. And the new age for really urban development today cannot go without green infrastructure. So we propose some areas along the region for government to consider green infrastructure. These are nature-based solutions that help in flood mitigation, also contributes to reducing urban heat island effects and improving population, which actually recharge groundwater aquifers. And of course, trees have enormous benefit. We know from the literature, enormous benefit in urban areas. So in terms of carbon gain and loss in the study area, we used the invest carbon model, and we looked at the four main carbon pools that go into that model. The above biomass, below biomass, dead carbon, and soil carbon. And here's the carbon map of the Gambia. Again, you could see that in the Gambia, most of the carbon content is in the West Coast region. So this is based on the data of land use land cover data of 2019. So for the projections, this is for business as usual. For the sustainability is on the right side. You could see based on the areas that we propose for sustainability, we can retain a lot of carbon, avoid emission of carbon into the atmosphere, and that for the business as usual, you tend to see less carbon in the area. So the carbon sequestration and valuation estimates can be summarized from this table. From 2003 to 2020, the area has lost 21,824 metric tons of carbon, and this is estimated to be equivalent to nearly $7 million based on Stone's valuation parameters. So if you look at the different scenarios we have, with the new capital city scenario, the area will likely lose 45,474 metric tons of carbon, and that's estimated to be nearly $11 million. With the business as usual, we see less emissions. Of course, with sustainability, we don't still see a net positive, in other words, for the area to absorb more carbon than it emits, but we have seen a drastic reduction in terms of the loss to damage to society and in terms of emissions to the atmosphere. So if people are interested on the interesting debate in climate change economics, I recommend looking at Stone and Nordhaus on the debate as far as the discounting and the parameters used in this model. The conclusion here we could draw: with the new capital city scenario, more carbon will be emitted due to forest degradation and land use change, and this will be equivalent to an economic loss of approximately $11 million using Stone's valuation parameters. And loss to biodiversity and ecosystem services will be grossly minimized if a sustainability scenario is considered. So one of my favorite parts is chapter 4. Is actually this idea: what do we really know about people's willingness to pay for coastal protection in developing countries, especially in Africa? We don't seem to know a lot about this. So the site here, we're looking at a recreational site, a tourist, whether it's for local tourism or international tourism. You don't go to Gambia without going to Senegambia. Senegambia is known for recreational activities like sport, picnic, swimming, and all the other recreational activities that take place on beach areas. It's also known for international tourists. We've seen arrival of tourists from Europe mainly to Gambia increasing over time. There is socio-ecological interaction with monkeys and with birds and other species in this area. So the question we ask are people willing to pay to for improved coastal protection against climate change impacts, in this case, rise in sea level in the area? And we look at the aggregate welfare value, which is the willingness to pay, whether that is greater or less than the cost of a project that was recommended to protect the Senegambia beach area against coastal erosion. Of course, excited about the literature again. Natural capital, stocks of assets provided by nature, and those services provide what is known to be ecosystem services. Recently, they called them nature's contribution to people. And so it's important that for this chapter, we're mainly focusing on cultural and recreational ecosystem services and a little bit of regulatory services, not so much on provision and services. Again, like I said before, the valuation studies that have been done for improved coastal protection, coastal preservation, beach maintenance and improvement, all of these studies mostly done in the developed world. Why not in the developing countries? Because we also have coastline. But we can use this framework to connect our natural capital to human well-being, right? How nature is related to social and economic systems. So nature provides services, right? We call them provisional, recreational, regulatory services. But for the recreational services, we know there are benefits that they generate. Those benefits people in different ways. But we can only know the benefit of these services by conducting studies like contingent evaluation studies to know the value perception of people. Once we know those value perceptions, we can inform policymakers as to what people care about or what they don't care about. And that way, the policymakers can make the right adjustment or right decisions in protecting areas that the public value. So the methodology, a little bit on contingent valuation, the payment method used in this study was cash, and the payment vehicle was contingent donation. The elicitation procedure for the pretest was double bounded dichotomous choice. For the main survey, it was the single bounded dichotomous choice. Before we presented the scenario, we provided some visual aid materials to help the respondents to make the right decisions, right? And that was the business as usual. And we showed them this improvement scenario. This is how the Senegambia Beach will look like if you offer anything to support the project. We presented the scenario really detailedly, in a more detailed way, by saying that the public will be expected to contribute about 40% of the total project cost. And the expected benefits of the project were outlined, the drawbacks of the project were also included, and people were asked to make an offer. Overall, we saw nearly 90% willingness to pay among people for various bid vectors or categories we have. And we did the aggregation. The aggregation was based on the urban population, given that our sample is more representative of the urban population. But we don't also believe that the rural population have zero willingness to pay because of the trickle-down effect of coastal tourism. The tourism industry benefits a lot of rural places, and I think they would have to, they will have some incentive to, have some interest in preserving the area. So whether you use the urban population or you use the national population for aggregation purpose, the cost-benefit analysis results show that we have a net present value that is positive. So the total project cost is about 13 million US dollars. The welfare value from this study is 14.5 million US dollars. So if we go by the scenario which was presented to the public, that is, if the public were to be responsible for only 40% of the total project cost, we have a net present value of $9.3 million. Even where the public were to pay for the entire project cost, we still have a net present value that is positive, about 1.5 million US dollars. Therefore, the conclusion we can draw here is that the beach improvement project that is outlined in Coates and Mani's study is a socially desirable investment of public funds, since the estimated aggregate value estimate outweighs the overall cost of the project. We conclude by saying that Gambians express high willingness to pay for beach protection despite being poor. And second, liquidity constraint may not necessarily translate to, should not necessarily be translated as having less value for restoration or mitigation projects. And where applicable, we should determine value by using other strategies like willingness to work as a payment method for people with less income. So that is the end of my presentation. The collaborative research I've been involved in include one paper that was submitted for peer review, and I am hoping to publish each of the chapters from this dissertation. And I'm also involved in other work with Steve and other people. I attend a couple of conferences to present this work, including in the mainly in the United States, in DC, in Wisconsin, and here at the University of Minnesota. And COVID-19, we couldn't do any conference this year, but those are the awards. So I thank you all for your kind attention.
Nice job, Famra. So I think we have some time for questions from other members beyond your committee, if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question for Famra.
May I ask a question? This is Deborah Levison.
Of course, go ahead, Deborah.
So, Famra, where do you go from here in terms of, I want to ask about the future and not about what you've completed so far. What are your next steps? It seems to me that there are a whole lot of different directions that you could go with this.
Yeah. For the next year coming, I'll be with the World Bank on a project that is looking at forced displacement. And this project, well, the center is in Copenhagen in Denmark, but I would likely I'll be in Denmark, but also be working in some country offices, perhaps in Bangladesh and Kenya. That's what I will start with. I am interested in international development work, be it with World Bank, UN agencies, but I'm really interested in doing research because there is this whole research gap in Africa that could be explored. So I'll be part of people who are looking at these issues in Africa, in other developing countries. And I'll get into academia at some point, next 3-4 years or so, I don't know. Yeah.
So I'm not hearing anything about politics, Gambian politics.
we will get into politics once we contribute something. It's not out of the, yeah, it's within things that I think about. But we'll start with, research and teaching and
Could I follow up one more time? I guess I'm interested in how you can use this research to make an impact on what your country does next.
it's a really good question. The plan was we were organizing a Africa Climate Change Conference, inviting other scholars from Africa, and I was going to host this in Banjul. The target was for people to attend, including my advisor, and that way we are able to talk to the president if he comes. But I think national conversation on this has to be ongoing, and we will create the platform. Whether I work currently with the Gambia government or not, I will have ways to connect and share what I learn. And I think that opportunity is there. So,
Well, best wishes.
thank you.
All right. Well, I think that concludes the public part of this presentation. So you've got some support from your audience, and I think those of you who are not on FAMRA's committee, you can go ahead and log off now. And then what I will do is invite the committee to a breakout room, and we'll just have a quick chat about process. And so FAMRA, you can just hold on, and then we'll come back to you after we chat a little bit. Sound good?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, we're all back. Steve.
We are back. Congratulations, Dr. Damfa.
Thank you.
Well done. I'm not surprised, but you did a very nice job of presenting it to the public, and then also in answering our questions, which were, I thought, very useful collection of pretty thoughtful questions, both on the dissertation itself, but also in thinking about going forward and implementing public policy and how are you going to help the Gambia and so forth. So anyway, I think there's things to think about with that. We talked briefly about, was there anything that people felt strongly about, for the dissertation itself? And there's not really. There's a couple of things that people will mention to you. And then formally how this works is that I think, Bonnie, you have a form now in the COVID era. We just send that around. It ends up in, well, I'll you can tell me what the official forms are. I think we're all ready to sign off on the forms of, yes, you have passed the defense. The only other thing formally for the university is that when you get the final version of the dissertation done, then I sign the front page saying, you've done everything. And there's probably a couple of things that people want you to do for that. But anyway, I'll let them talk about it. But, both Bonnie and I said, well, we've seen this all the way along and we've given you lots of comments. So there's nothing from my perspective that I think absolutely needs to be here. But, I think there's a few things that can be done. I'll let others say what they wish to see.
Thank you.
So I'll go really quickly because I also have the form open here on my computer. And so I can, as the rest of the committee talks, I can make a couple notes if there's specific things. But I think the main take home is that you've completed an amazing dissertation. Everybody's really thrilled with what you've done. It's a huge accomplishment. It's an incredible body of work. And knowing how much work went into every part of it, and your ability to synthesize just a vast amounts of literature from so many different fields, I thought was really impressive. And just such an interesting and timely and deeply personal topic. It's just been a real pleasure to watch you work through this and see the dedication that you have to this particular topic. So I had questions on your manuscripts, but mostly that was like, if you want to publish this, here are some thoughts about how to translate this into a peer-reviewed manuscript. So I won't go into the details of it. It's sort of like reorganize this section, cut this text. I'm not sure if these pieces fit together, but that's all. I just took notes on a PDF and I'll send that to you. But nothing that I think is critical for submitting the dissertation, really just thoughts about how to package this as a set of publications, if that's your next step. So I'll let Gabe say something and then Dean, and then we'll wrap up.
So a really amazing job, and thanks for sharing your work with us. And it was really great. I think my main comments that I'll send over are just a few places in the dissertation to, I think, reference to some additional literature, particularly in the public affairs realm of some of the things we talked about today, such as implementation and really some of the institutional context. But they're pretty minor, and I think overall it's really fantastic work.
Yeah, I just agree with everyone else. Really an impressive piece of work. Congratulations. And the only comment I did have was on looking at that protected areas definition and how you might make that a little clearer. Actually, I'll go back and look at that myself and then send you any comments I have. But again, well done.
Thank you.
Great. So congratulations. I've submitted your, logged everybody's votes, and I'll send that form will be out now. And yeah, it's a huge, like we talked about, this really big deal, and we're so proud of you, and congratulations. And I really, really hope that you'll keep in touch, because I feel like we're also, I hope you know how invested we are in your success, and really want to make sure that we continue to have your back wherever you go next and follow this amazing career that you're just beginning. And happy birthday to your son.
Yeah.
Thank you. If I'm just allowed to say a statement, final statement would be, I owe this to everybody, including you, and for all of the support. And I'm almost crying because I think it was a big sacrifice from everybody who contributed. And I think of all the stories in different ways. I also think about my dad. When I started my undergraduate degree, said I would withdraw all of my retirement just to invest in you.
We're extremely proud of you. Congratulations. I hope you have take some time off. I hope you celebrate with family and friends. It's too bad it's in the era of COVID. We would love to all celebrate with you together, but just know that we're thinking of great thoughts about you today, and really wonderful job. Cheers.
Now spread the word on that Gambian WhatsApp.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Good to see everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye from our